Hello and welcome to today's webinar, where today, of course, we're talking about the three hottest ways to unlock off-market opportunities right here, right now. I speak to a lot of people, I have a lot of guests on our webinars, and today's an opportunity for me to kind of sweat that down and tell you what I think is the kind of the common themes that I'm seeing, and then kind of how Nimbus can help you with all of that. For those of you who don't know, this is me looking particularly serious, and that serious face I often kind of liken to the marketplace that we currently sit in here. So the key reason why that sort of serious face comes out is because really I see kind of three things colliding at the moment. Those three things individually are enough to make a, dare I say, a storm in their own right. Those three things are obviously coming together at the same time, create this very interesting marketplace we currently see ourselves in. And apologies for the rather dramatic slide that I put up on the screen here. In essence, I was looking for a little picture of George Clooney, a little boat going up a big wave in the perfect storm in effect, which is kind of what's kind of going through my mind at the moment. And the reason why I sort of talk about these three things colliding is, of course, that we have these things happening. We have, of course, a new use class order that has brought in this thing called Class E. We have, of course, new development rights. So we had a whole swathe of those that came out last year, and a new one that came out this year with this new thing called Class MA. And of course, in case you haven't missed it, we've had this thing called COVID that's hit us, that's kind of locked us all up in our homes for the last 18 months and really changed the way that we live, the way that we then think about our assets, and the way in which owners of buildings are kind of thinking about what it is they're going to do with those things. So we had this kind of huge change in the way that the stakeholders around buildings their sort of mindsets have moved on in effect. And so those three things at the same time colliding in a single marketplace creates the opportunity that we have right here, right now. I suppose before I kind of go into the detail around all of that and start to explain which strategies then I think are the kind of most interesting and the ones that you can exploit right now, first off, I want to just take a step back and I want to start saying, well, actually, how do we engage with that marketplace? Where do we find this stuff? And then we're going to work out what we're going to find after that. And I suppose what becomes very obvious is we start talking about the benefits of off-market versus on-market. And that's two things, right? On or off. But actually, what was kind of interesting as we start to think about this in a bit more detail, and I sort of started to engage with my brother on this, my co-founder and brother here at Nimbus, is that actually we realized it's more than just two things. It's actually three. And it's these three things. So you have on-market opportunities. Those are the things that surveyors stick on the market or estate agents put on the market, and there's a to-let or for sale board on the outside. There's an agent instructor whose job is to go and rev that marketplace up and get people interested in this particular building. I'd put auctions into that on-market sort of bucket, if you like. And of course, then we have off-market. And off-market means two different things to different people. There's V1, as we call it. V1 is the kind of stuff actually that we did a lot of back in the days when we were buying sites and being retained by various different people. And in effect, what that is that's where you have a retained agent, or you have a sort of a friendly surveyor or friendly estate agent, something like that brings you opportunities that they've sniffed out. So they're out and they're talking to people in the marketplace and they're realizing so-and-so wants to sell something and they're bringing that site through to you. That's an off-market number one. So there's no for sale board on the outside, but there is an agent that's brought that through to you. And then V2 is sites that you've unlocked yourself. And that typically is through properties that you think might be interesting for you, then unlock those sites yourself. There's kind of some challenges in the old school world of this, saying, well, how do I know if that building is of interest? How do I know if it's on profile? How do I know? And of course, that's something we're going to cover off today. But before I do that, one of the things that I thought was very interesting is I ran a survey across my LinkedIn profile. So these are all the people that I've connected with over the course of a number of years. And what was interesting is I asked them a question. I asked them one simple question, which is what works best for you when you're buying developments, investments, or land? And I thought what was kind of rather interesting is the answer to it. And the answer was this. So you can see at the bottom, I had about 3,500 views of, what's my cursor now? There it is. I had about 3,500 views of the, there we go, sorry, my cursor was shooting across my various screens at the moment. So about 3,500 views of this particular poll, if you like, that I ran in LinkedIn. What was interesting is that 9% of people, kind of 10% if you like, make maths easy, were finding stuff through stuff being on market, and we're kind of comfortable that that was a good way. So 1 in 10 people are doing that, 1 in 11 people actually. What was interesting is that the balance of the 90%, 91%, were then split evenly across the two versions of off market, if you like, V1, V2. So friendly agents bringing sites to them, or indeed letter campaigning. And I suppose what's kind of interesting then, when I started breaking that down further, is to say, well, actually, what do these look like? What's the point? Which one's better? Why would I go one way or the other? And of course, as I broke that down, so this is a sort of the thoughts kind of sweated down into hopefully a reasonably simple slide. We have on market on the left-hand side. Now, what was kind of interesting with this is that obviously, because it's on market, you have a willing seller. That's why they put it on the market in the first place. And of course, there's a quoting price on that. So the pricing is open, or at least vaguely open. There's perhaps a guide price or something like that. Maybe there's kind of offers invited, but in essence, there's some sort of guide around where you need to be in order for that person to sell. The red box then talks about the challenges. And so in effect, the challenges around it is, of course, there's an agent involved whose job is to go and rev the marketplace up and create competition, which means that it is typically inherently competitive in that marketplace. If you're bidding for land and developments, of course, the person that's going to win that bid, the person that's going to create a sort of put the highest offer forward, is the one that's going to look at their appraisal and say, well, actually, I'm prepared to push the GDV a little bit harder than everybody else. I'm prepared to trim the build cost down a little bit less than everybody else is. I'm prepared to take a slightly lower profit margin than anybody else is prepared to pay. So in essence, what you have is people that are prepared to take a bit more risk than the rest of the marketplace in order to be able to buy these sites in effect. There are some further challenges around it as well, because actually to get yourself to the point of putting an offer in on a development site, you kind of need to understand how much you can get on there and this sort of stuff. So you need to start tapping into some consultants, you need some architects, you need perhaps a QS, something like that, to give you a build cost and this sort of stuff. And of course, because it's a competitive environment, you have low conversion rates, which means that you're burning that goodwill from those consultants, because you're kind of asking them to do stuff, and hopefully you're getting that sort of as a freebie, but perhaps you might start paying for that stuff at the same time, because actually the conversion rates are quite low. So then for them to support you and put this speculative work in to support your bid, then of course that becomes a bit of a challenge for them in effect. So it sort of burns that goodwill that perhaps isn't best spent there. You can find them quite easily. I mean, there's sort of 400 websites for surveyors across the sort of the main surveyors, if you like. There's Rightmove, there's Zoopla, and there's kind of the commercial versions of each. There's Rightmove commercial and Zoopla commercial. So it's quite easy to find this stuff, but it's actually then sort of in this marketplace where you have got a willing seller and open pricing, but of course you've got this competitive sort of market that you're kind of working in, and then the way you're going to win those bids is that actually you're going to, in essence, pay a little bit more than anybody else is prepared to pay for that property, and take on a little bit more risk than anybody else in order to unlock those schemes. Coming into the middle one, which is then of course the off market, where you've got an agent involved that's brought you a set of particulars. I was speaking to so and so last week, and actually they said they might be prepared to sell this particular site, and I immediately thought of you, and here's a set of particulars. What do you think about this? Or here's a title plan and a tenant schedule. Do you want to go and buy this? And what's great about that is that, of course, you can be passive for that. So you can, provided that you maintain a relationship with that person and you make sure they're clear what it is you're looking for, you can sit back and wait for those opportunities to sort of land in your lap, in effect. And they will typically come with a willing seller. Typically, not always, typically there's someone prepared to sell something. That's why the agent's kind of pre-qualified that for you and then sent you across a set of particulars. So you can sit back, wait for those opportunities to come to you with a willing seller, and then in essence, you're hopefully then going to be able to unlock those deals. The challenge with it is that the properties aren't always on profile. So you can be as clear as you possibly can be with agents. But of course, the buildings that they're seeing and the off-market opportunities they're seeing are what they're seeing, and they may not sit perfectly with what you're looking to try and do. So by very nature of it, they're going to send you stuff that is often slightly off profile. And you have to sit there and go, actually, do I want to do that? Do I not want to do that? What's my feeling around all of that? there's also a challenge around it about the scalability of it. There's only so many people you can play golf with. There's only so many people you can have coffees with and this sort of stuff. There's only so many surveyors across an area that you can do this with, and so many estate agents you can do this with. There's only so much of that that's possible to get a certain amount of scale into this. For every site you're going to buy, you're going to pay them a fee. That's kind of what's in it for them. That's what's going to allow you to sit back and wait for this stuff to come along. And of course, that fee only gets paid if you buy that site, which means that actually it's in the surveyor or the agent's interest for you to buy that site, really, whether it's in your best interest or not. Good surveyors won't necessarily push you to do stuff that you don't want to do. But of course, they get paid if you go and buy it. So it's in their interest to present it in a compelling light to get you to buy these things, because then the fee becomes due and off you go. And I suppose there's that same problem with the kind of the on-market stuff, where you're burning goodwill in on-market with your architects and planners and all this kind of advice that you're getting as part of it. The same slightly true in terms of that off-market with the agent working for you, in the fact that if they keep bringing stuff to you and you keep saying no, don't like it, then at some point they're going to get bored and move on to the next person. And so there is this sort of worry that you're going to burn goodwill, and so this pressure sort of mounts in the background to buy something through these agents. Otherwise, you feel like you might sort of lose the relationship, if you like, and that pipeline of opportunities. And the other thing that is slightly painful about this is that typically that agent that's bringing you this set of particulars will want to sort of cast the net a little bit more than just one person. They won't want to just back one horse. They'll probably send it to sort of 3 or 4 people in the hope that one of those 3 or 4 people will then move forward. They won't send it to 10 or 20, because of course then it becomes difficult to manage, and sort of it becomes less off market at that point. There's kind of, so actually they will send it to a few people. So it is a competitive environment. It's just that it's less competitive than sort of being fully on market. And of course, the way that you unlock all of these things is through this blue box here at the bottom, through relationships. It's about managing that relationship. It's about spending time with that person. It's about explaining what you want. It's about explaining your track record and helping them to understand who you are, what you want, what's going to float your boat, and what you're going to go for. I think what's kind of interesting then is when you paint the picture in the same way around the off-market, the truly off-market opportunities, where in essence what we do here is we let a campaign to owners of buildings that are suitable for what you're looking for. What's kind of interesting with this is that typically these things take a bit longer, and typically you can get the owners of those buildings to come along on a journey with you, which means you can take more time, you can have more control over around the purchase, and often you can share a little bit of risk with the owner of the property and buy stuff subject to planning or buy stuff under option agreements, because actually you're motivating that seller to work with you to get in both of your kind of benefits, in effect, a common goal, in effect. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. What's kind of useful about it is that there's really no limit on the number of letters you can send. So it's truly scalable without having to go and work a load of relationships with hundreds of people and this sort of stuff. And of course, if you run it correctly, the properties that you find are ones you've pre-selected, which means they are always on profile. They're always in line with what it is you're actually looking to go and do. You're not getting asked, well, I know you wanted to go and do this over here. Well, would this be close enough? Or do you, so in effect, it's always on profile of what you're looking to try and achieve. That brings us some other benefits around optimization and being very, very good at a sort of a narrow thing and spending your time really optimizing the sort of the downstream process, all of that. All of that stuff is also a big positive of this kind of off-market letter campaign. Drawbacks to, and that is, it takes a bit of effort. You've got to go and send those letters, kind of the activity to drive that. But of course, you haven't got to go and manage relationships and things at the same time. So you've got some capacity back, which kind of in effect produces that capacity to go and put it into this. The challenge as well is there's no open pricing, there's no agent involved. So the owner of a building is just coming straight to you, and you have to go and explain to them what the value of that site is and why it's worth what it's worth, and how you might be able to work together to drive the values up. And this can take some time. So this isn't something that happens straight away. Sometimes you get lucky with it and you find somebody that's just desperately keen to do something at a certain point, but it can take a little bit longer. And that's very much in your benefit, frankly, because then you can start to align those owners with what it is you want to go and deliver yourself, and kind of why you're speaking to them, and of course tie it into some just planning deals and this kind of stuff. And the typical thing that you need to unlock this is, firstly, set on a strategy. You may cover off 3 today, and then the magic number then is 100 letters. If you send 100 letters out that are all to on target, on profile owners of buildings that have been pre-selected, then what you'll find is that, provided your letter is sensible and it's soft and it's just saying, just get in touch if you have any plans to in fact, let's talk about that. That letter wants to say something like, apologies for the unsolicited approach, but I've done some research on your property and I think it could be suitable for me. If you have any plans to dispose of all or part, then please get in touch. We are currently paying in excess of market prices for buildings that are on profile for what we want. So we'd like to hear from you. Kind regards, yours sincerely, in my case, Paul Davis, mobile phone number, email address. Come back to me if you've got any kind of interest in doing that. And in essence, what that will give you is, it will give you about a 10% response rate. So you send 100 letters out, you get about 10 people, somewhere between 8 and 10 people, depending on the sector, depending on the size of the properties you're looking at and this sort of stuff. Half of those people will come back and say, thanks for the letter, Paul, but I've no interest in selling at the moment. When I hear that, I hear no, not yet, rather than no, never. And of course, I'll just drop a little note, perhaps in 6 months' time, and just say, well, is the situation still the same? Still like your property, etc., etc. But the other half, which is about 4 or 5 people, will come back and say, it's funny you've written to me now, actually. I'm so fed up of being locked down for the last 18 months. I've decided I want to go and sell this building. Interesting you wrote to me now. I was about to go and pick the phone up to an agent next week. Let's have a conversation. And so that's really the true benefit of that third piece, the off-market letter campaign. So for me, there's a clear winner out of these three ways of kind of tapping into that marketplace. I suppose let's just move on now. Let's move on to the thorny subject of kind of why deals fail. And really, there's only 2 reasons why that's the case. We've done really quite a lot of development schemes, and in essence, the kind of the 2 reasons why these things fail is that, firstly, we can't get planning for what it is we're proposing to do. That's the first and most frustrating thing of any scheme, of course. And of course, the other thing is it doesn't stack up. You can't make the numbers stack up in terms of what we're trying to put forward. And so what's kind of interesting, when we sort of think about the previous slide, when we're sort of talking about stuff that's on profile, we can really set ourselves up to succeed. And what I mean by that is that if we search in areas where we can drive value into a building, there's only 2 ways you can do that. One is to increase the density of what you've got. You buy a bungalow, knock it down and build 10 flats almost. I mean, you drive the number of units, drive the floor space up on the site that you've got, or you change the use from one lower value use into a higher value use, or ideally a combination of both. Then that's how we drive value into a site. Very, very simple. The second thing we can then do as part of this search is we can then align the planning policies that sit behind this kind of proposed scheme, this strategy we're going to go and target, excuse me. We can check the planning policies sit behind that and they actually align, which means that when we then go forward to pre-app or planning application stage, that actually those things aren't going to come back and bite us and say, well, actually, you can't do this on this particular site because. So if we can align the fact we're going to drive value into a site and the planning policy that sits behind it is then going to be supportive of that, we're starting to get in a good place. What those 2 things do for you is they then allow you to talk to an owner and say, well, if I was to buy this site off you, this is what it's worth. And we can give you a whole load of comparables that explain why what you've got is worth this much money, and it's that much. There's this thing we can do through planning, which is going to drive those values up. So we're going to intensify the use or change the use and make that value higher, which means that with my involvement, we can make that worth this much. And actually, I'll pay for the cost of all of that. That's nothing you've got to worry about. I'm going to bring the skills, I'm going to bring the money. We're going to make sure we make this all happen. But that difference in price, you and I can split. But in order for that to happen, what we need you to do is we need you to come on the journey with us. So you're going to earn more and make more out of this site than what it's currently worth. But the reason you're going to do that is because you make more money. But I only want it if I've got this planning consent in place. So I'm going to go off and I'm going to get that planning consent, and then I'm going to pay you more than the building's worth. Actually, it's worth more, and I've done the work to go and do that. But we're going to share the proceeds of that as part of this. So in essence, what you're going to do is you're going to grant me an option, which I can buy it for this pre-agreed price, which is this much that we've agreed the price was, plus this extra bit on top, because that's what it's worth more than that once I've got the planning consent in place. And that is why you're going to grant me an option, because I'm going to spend some money on the site. I'm going to put some time and effort into making that site worth more than it's worth at the moment. You know, I buy under option, I buy under subject planning. I don't really mind which. There are some stamp duty implications that options are usually better than buying subject to planning, but either work, and it's really down to what you can get away with the owner. There is this thing called COVID, and there's this kind of uncertainty in the marketplace. And so if we can then at the same time put in multiple exits to that end use, that end scheme, then it means when we hit the marketplace, and actually we've cashed our option in and we've bought this site and we're about to start building it out, if the market has moved on at that point, then I can switch schemes. And provided I've had those kind of baked into the background, and I know that the scheme stacks up, around those different ways of those different schemes that I've got in the background, then of course that switch isn't a particularly big problem. I just change the planning application that goes in, and I sort of pivot at that point. And of course, having got all of that lined up, if I can then tap into a great design team, then great design teams bring some real positive benefits. They bring the kind of the contacts with the local council. They'll know firstly who the right officers are to speak to, who the case officer is. They'll know then who all the consultees are. So who is the conservation officer that's going to be difficult on this particular building? Who's the hydrologist that's going to get involved when it comes to the flooding issues or something like that? Who's the person that's going to sign off the drainage scheme or whatever it is? Which means that typically this great design team will typically build the right scheme for the right price, which means the whole thing then hangs together. So in essence, I suppose to sweat that slide down is something very simple. What we're really looking at is taking a particular strategy, aligning planning policy with it, finding sites then that match those two things, and then simply letter campaigning for 100 letters. We get 10 responses back, half of those are positive. We get five in effect responses that are saying, well, let's have a conversation. We go and see those people. We then align what we want to go and do with those owners. We can then do all the work downstream of that. And actually, because we're doing an open book with them and saying, well, I think you've got scope to change the use or drive the number of units up, because they're clear on that, I can then do a pre-app that sits in line with all of that, which just builds the credibility rather than letting the cat out of the bag. If I did that on an on-market opportunity, then lets the cat out of the bag, the value goes up and gets more and more competitive with spending more and more money on these things. So of course, the whole thing starts to sweat together into something very, very positive indeed. So today is all about what those three hot strategies are. So I've sort of spent the last 25 minutes talking about how we're going to tap into them and why we're going to tap into them and what that approach is going to be. But what are those three top strategies? Well, those three top strategies are in effect these. Commercial conversions, that's the first thing. This whole change of planning legislation and the raft of new PD rights that sit on top of that. Commercial conversions are a very interesting place to be at the moment. Residential land and airspace. So part of the PD rights that came out last year was all about airspace and 2 stories above, all sorts of different buildings in effect. And we're going to talk about all these in more detail in a second. There is also a lot of land available. People sort of say to me, well, hasn't all the land gone? And actually, it really, really hasn't. You just know where to look for it. And we'll talk about that today too. In essence, it's down to that one of those first slides that I showed you, which is about driving the number of units up. There's plenty of land, low density units with big gardens, big sort of gardens, corner plots, all this kind of stuff where you can drive those number of units up very, very simply. And there's also this one. Most people see HMOs as kind of the thing that you do after some buy-to-let, do some HMOs, and then you start moving to development. But actually, HMOs for me are a really interesting way of driving much higher yields out of buildings. There's the new school way of doing it, if you like, which is kind of this rent-to-rent model, where you take a big HMO, you take a lease, in effect, or management agreement on that big HMO, you let each individual room out. Or you can package it up. So the stuff that we did was in effect to put a lease in place to Warwick University on an HMO, when in effect we'd get an 8% yield off the back of it rather than a 4% yield. It's very, very simple. And actually the commercial conversions that we were doing with the HMOs as the end game on it were very sympathetic for that, because you got a whole load of very tall, thin buildings with a number of little rooms in them, just very naturally split into individual bedrooms with a shared kitchen, lounge, diner. So actually the overall building itself was very sympathetic for HMOs. And I sort of feel like they're a sort of a use class that is sort of seen as something that's kind of a stepping stone along a sort of a property journey, if you like. But actually, they're just a great way of driving high returns in a property portfolio. So that's all fine, but we're talking about planning policies here. So what planning policies underpin all of this? So the first one is commercial conversions. So we've got three strategies. Those are what the three strategies are. We're now going to look at the individual planning policies that sit alongside these and how we can then look at those individual opportunities. So when we're talking about commercial conversions, there's this new thing called Class MA. It applies to Class E, and it's a very interesting way of unlocking that change of use from a lower value commercial building into a higher value residential property. Class G was the old shops with uppers that people used to talk about. So in effect, what the old version of Class G was all about was in effect in the case above a shop actually being extended. We're going to talk about that in a moment. A new thing called Class ZA, and in some respects, it's not really a commercial conversion. It's converting a commercial site into residential, but you're knocking the building down and rebuilding it. So Class ZA says you can take certain commercial buildings, knock them down, rebuild them off the same footprint, and put 2 stories. So you rebuild them as flats off the same footprint, and then put 2 stories on top again as flats. There are some other options you can also do. So if you take a low value commercial building in a residential area, and in this case, what I've got in mind is that you're looking at the streets and you see house, 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 office, house, 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 then that office naturally converts into a house or a flat or whatever, it will block of flats or whatever. And it sits very comfortably within that area. So we're looking for those commercial buildings where it's got that residential feel to it, all around it's kind of residential. And actually taking that building out of that commercial use and putting that to residential sits very comfortably. So what are these PD rights that we're talking about? Well, Class MA, in effect, is this. So what it says is that if you take a building that's up to 1,500 square meters, quite a big building, that 1,500 square meters, not feet, meters, so 16,000 feet, something like that, which is kind of big enough for 25, 30 flats, quite a big building, that. If that building then isn't in Article 2.3 land, so it's not in AONB, it's not a special protection area, it's not in the Broads, it's not a national park, not in a World Heritage Site. If it's not in triple SI, so site special scientific interest, try saying that without your teeth in, it's not in a safety hazard zone, it's not in a military explosive area, and if the building's not listed, then you can start to apply these PD rights. The building has to be vacant for 3 months prior to submitting the prior approval, if you like, and the building must have been in Class E use. This is this new super use where in effect you're taking a lot of the old, so the A1, A2, A3, the old B1 uses and parts of D1 and D2 come into this broader Class E planning use. So provided the building's been in that use for the last 2 years, then you can start to apply this Class MA. So that's the first one that you can use. The second one is this new Class G. And again, so Class G used to be shop uppers. Take a shop with some first floor storage or whatever, second floor storage, and you could put 2 flats into that space under the old Class G. Very few restrictions. That old Class G has now been extended in effect into what I'm calling the new Class G. It's still Class G, frankly. What it allows you to do is to take a Class E building and change the use of the upper floors into 2 residential units. There's no restrictions around whether you can do it listed buildings, you can do it in town centres, you can do it in conservation areas, you can do it in national parks. There's very few restrictions about where you can do Class G. It's a very kind of open PD rights. There's actually no restriction around locations. For us, though, there's kind of this underlying principle of just because I can doesn't mean to say I should. And actually, for us, you really want to be in a sustainable location if you can. You want to be in a town or village that's got 700 people or more. And it just means that you're not going to have that NIMBYism in the background. You're not going to suddenly start rubbing up against the local council and this sort of stuff, or the parish council, and start having problems around getting sort of winning the hearts and minds for this scheme you're putting forward, in effect. And quite frankly, it's as simple as that the upper floor must be in a commercial use above a Class E use, which previously used to be a retail use, in effect. And you can apply this change of use to the upper parts into 2 flats, and off we go. The third one was Class ZA. So Class ZA, in effect, is this. It allows you to demolish commercial buildings and rebuild those commercial buildings off the same footprint as flats with 2 stories on top. But there's a maximum height. You can't go above 18 meters for that new sort of 18 meters the height of the building, if you like. It can't go above that height with once the new building's built, in effect. There's some restrictions around, you can't do it to protected buildings. So for the sort of the majority of these PD rights that were announced last year, buildings that are protected, then they don't apply to, in effect. And so in the case of this, it's listed buildings, it's AONB, sites of special scientific interest. If any of these things apply, then you can't apply this PD right to it. The building's protected, and therefore we're not just going to go blundering in, knock it down, and rebuild this thing as flats. Because you're more sympathetic than that. These are kind of cherished assets in cherished locations for us, and therefore we need to protect those, which is in effect where this PD right then doesn't apply. What's interesting is that the Class G PD rights do apply in those locations, because it's more of a simple change in the inside of the building rather than this, which is kind of quite it's a very comprehensive thing you're doing. So I was going through and I say, well, actually, you can't list the buildings, you can't do it in AONB, areas of outstanding natural beauty. You can't do it in SSSI, sites special scientific interest. You can't do it in scheduled monuments, of course. You can't do it in safety hazard areas. You can't do it in military explosive areas or within 1.86 miles, I think it's 2.5 kilometers or 3 kilometers of an aerodrome. And you can't do it in Article 2.3 land, which includes conservation areas. For us, again, it wants to be in a sustainable location. I don't think it actually needs to be, but it kind of wants to be, because if you're going to build a block of flats, you want that to have an exit. You want to make sure that you're in an area where flats are wanted. The building footprint this time, so in the Class MA, it was the complete size of the building, which was 16,000 square feet or 1,500 square meters. That's the whole building under Class MA. Under Class ZA, which is this, the building footprint, so the space around the space enclosed by the outside of where the brickwork meets the ground, if you like, needs to be less than 1,000 square meters. So if it's a 3-story building, it can be 3,000 square meters, 33,000 feet or so. But it's that footprint that matters under Class ZA. And it's not the whole of Class E that's included in this, it's just the old B1 uses. So it's offices, light industrial and R&D buildings that are covered where you can apply this Class ZA to it. And what's interesting then is that the building then needs to have been vacant for 6 months in order for you to be able to apply for this new PD right. It's a prior approval rather than PD, rather than the old school PD. It's prior approval rather than fitted development. But in essence, that's what that gives you. For those that you have been particularly vigilant with this, is that you'll see that the Class G PD rights have no time constraint on them. There's no time issue. So with Class MA, the building needs to have been empty for 3 months in order to be able to claim that PD right. And the Class ZA, the PD rights only get applicable after 6 months. But under Class G, which is the upper parts, there's no time constraint on that, which actually means, kind of interestingly, when we start saying, well, how do we get building because we want to go unlock some value at the upper parts, of course, G is immediately implementable. So you can then go forward, perhaps with a, dare I say, a hostile Section 25 notice to move a tenant out, because Class G applies at that time. Class MA doesn't apply, Class ZA doesn't apply either, but of course, Class G would apply, and therefore you can go and get your PD rights around that and then go back in for your Class MA afterwards. As I said before, the other thing that you can consider is a low value commercial properties in residential areas. You can look for that street scene of house, 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 office, house, 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 or house, 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 MOT bay, house, 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 and look at those as the opportunities to take that lower value use, knock it down, rebuild it, convert it from MOT bay to residential or whatever, depending on the particular property. So those are really, for me, the sort of the underlying policies that support that commercial conversion strategy. The second set of strategies or the second strategy rather, is the residential land and airspace strategy. Now, the policies that support that are these ones here. So there's kind of a couple of bits I want to talk about really. So the first bit is these new PD rights that came out last year, which are these ones here. So Class A, AA, AB, Class AC and AD, and then Class ZA. So those are the new ones, and we're going to talk about those individually, like we've just done with the last three. The other things we can do when it comes to residential land and airspace opportunities is, of course, we can also apply that low-value commercial buildings in residential areas and target those to create, in effect, knock them down to create the land that allows us to go and build residential properties on them. Or indeed, what we call residential development plots. This is really where you're saying, where do I find a house with a big garden? So in effect, I'm buying the house with this big garden, which gives me some land as part of it. And typically what I'm doing when I'm buying that stuff is I'm buying a house for what the house is worth. And typically the garden gets thrown in as part of it. You don't tend to pay an awful lot more for a house with a big garden than the same size house with a smaller garden. It's just I'm buying a 4-bed or I'm buying a 3-bed kind of thing. And so what that gives you the opportunity to do is to find, where do I see that sort of small house on a big piece of land relative to its neighbours, and I then bring the density of that site up in line with the neighbouring properties in effect. So those are the kind of the two extra bits. But let's kind of look at the Class A's, AA, AB, AC, AD, and Class ZA again, because there's actually a slight tweak with Class ZA, because it covers 2 bits, Class ZA does. We'll come back to that in a second. First off, Class A, AA, and AB. So what does that allow us to do? So this allows you to, in effect, take a 3-story block of flats in effect. And it doesn't matter whether the ground floor is in commercial use or not. If the ground floor is in residential use, so it's a block of flats in effect, it needs to be a 3-story block of flats and it must be detached. If it's got commercial on the ground floor, it can be detached or it can be terraced or semi-detached, doesn't matter. So the commercial bit on the ground floor means that you can do it to attached buildings if that's a thing. What it allows you to do is then to put 2 stories on top of those buildings in effect. Once again, you can't do it to protected assets in protected areas. You can't do it to listed buildings. You can't do it in areas of outstanding beauty. You can't do it in sites of special scientific interest, and you can't do it in national parks. The building height, once built, must be less than 24 meters high. The building needs to be built between 1948 and 2018. And for us, those values got to be viable. So it needs to be in areas where the values are high enough for you to be able to put more space on top of these buildings, in effect. It's not going to be a cheap thing to build. Perhaps it's off-site manufacturing you're using. Perhaps it's sort of constructing it locally. And if it is that, then there may be some kind of structural work to worry about. Maybe we're bracing this building, we're underpinning it. Kind of all that stuff needs to be considered. So the build cost isn't going to be your standard residential build cost, it's slightly higher. And so in essence, we want to make sure we're searching in areas where those values are high enough that that work can be kind of paid for out of the value of what you're creating. Those adjustments to the building, that strengthening the building, is all covered under the PD rights that apply to this. Kind of is baked into that new policy that's put in place. But you've got to pay for it, and therefore the areas you want to search for these things need to be slightly more valuable than where perhaps you might otherwise look for a side garden or a back garden or something like that. And again, crucially for us, it wants to be in sustainable locations. you want to be putting these buildings into places where there's other residential properties, so that it's a place where the council is going to want to support you to do this sort of stuff. If you can do it outside of those areas, but the worry that you then have is that whilst the PD rights apply, the council don't really want you to go and do it. They don't sort of see it as a thing, and they don't really see it as being the right thing to do in those locations, and therefore they'll just throw everything at you they possibly can to try and stop you doing it, which is kind of countering to the point of what we're trying to achieve with this. So for us, you want to be in those sustainable locations so you're focusing on the right stuff and not sort of getting to that point where it's going to be difficult to move this stuff forward. So that's Class A, AA, and AB. The reason why there's three of them is Class A applies to the 3-story blocks of flats only. AA and AB then talk about the commercial on the ground floor, whether it's a detached building or whether it's semi-detached or terraced in effect. So you just apply a different PD right. Broadly speaking, they're the same, you just apply a different PD right as part of it. Then you've got AC and AD. So what AC and AD look at is airspace above houses. And in essence, what it's looking to do is to put either a single story on top of a bungalow or 2 stories on top of a block on top of a house in effect. And what you can do is in that additional space above that house, if you like, the bungalow or the house, is that extension that you put on top, the 2 stories on top of a 2-story house or the single story on top of a bungalow, is that that extra space can either be as flats or as an extension to the existing house. So the 2-story house becomes a 4-story house, or the bungalow becomes a 2-story house. Or alternatively, it can be a 2-story house with 2 flats on top of it, or 1 flat on top of it, maisonette and 2 maisonettes, if that makes sense. Or into the bungalow, it can be a flat with a flat on top of it, in effect. That's why there's kind of 2 sets of PD rights. Again, you can't do that to protected assets in protected areas. You can't do it to listed buildings. You can't do it to Article 2.3 land, which is AONB, special protection areas, the Broads, national parks, World Heritage Sites. And you can't do it in SSSI either, so sites of special scientific interest. And again, you can't do that in conservation areas either. The buildings need to have been built between 1948 and 2018 and need to have not previously been extended upwards. If there's been a planning application to make it bigger, then of course you can't then use it again and again and again. It's just silly, obviously. But it's limited only to C3 houses, in effect, C3 properties. And once again, for us, it wants to be in those sustainable locations. Again, you just want to be putting more residential in the areas where they want it, where the council wants it, rather than elsewhere. In those kind of villagey locations or kind of the hamlet locations where we don't really want more housing, you can't really serve yourself there, you're getting in the car to go everywhere. It's just not something that the council wants. And therefore, whilst you probably could get away with it, is it right? Is it the best thing to do? And is it the best place for you to search? Not in our minds, in essence. So to recap, the planning policies that support it, or the new PD rights that support it, are, of course, these. We've just been through those in detail. You can also look at those low-value commercial buildings in residential areas, convert those, and sort of move them out of that area, in effect. It's really kind of looking for where's that commercial building sat in the residential areas that, in essence, is providing nuisance. Having an MOT base sat behind the chimney pots is really going to make noise. It's going to create cars parked on the road outside the houses. It's just something that those two uses aren't going to sit comfortably together, and therefore getting rid of that use is very much going to sit within policy, typically, something the council will support us with. And of course, then the other one is then looking for houses with those big side gardens, back gardens, corner plots, and that stuff, where we can then just drive more units onto that site, either on a comprehensive scheme, knock it down and build more, or indeed just to infill behind the side and this sort of stuff. Very simple ways to really drive value into sites, of course. What do I mean by that? Well, really, the policy, really, so the first one perhaps is kind of interesting. So the first one is the Class G PD right. So the Class G, again, is that use Class E now. It used to be shops with upper parts putting 2 flats above. Now it's use Class E. And taking those upper parts and converting those to residential. What's interesting with the Class G PD rights is you can then take from the 2 flats into C4. And that's a big development right. You can't do that in Article 4 areas, but you can do that everywhere else. C4 to sui generis is then the next one. We're going to talk about kind of what that usually looks like. And then C3 to C4 in Article 4 areas, in effect, sits before all of that. Options are then similar again, where you can take low value areas where an HMO marketplace and convert those, or knock them down and rebuild them as HMOs, purpose-built HMOs, of course. Residential C3s to HMO, of course, kind of C4 and sui generis. And the other thing I suppose you can do with HMOs is you can look at, where can I find a 4-bed HMO and put 6 in? It's going to drive the return up by 50%. So where can I find that 4-bed HMO that I can drive up to 6 beds, or even 7-bed or 8-bed or something like that, where I can then just drive the return up much higher, which means the capital value will come along with that, or indeed I just make a higher return off the back of them. So Class G with Class L. So Class G we've talked about. Class L then is that conversion from C3 to C4 after you've created your C3 properties from the Class G PD rights. So Class G now takes Class E properties, which is that broader commercial use, all those different uses all kind of merged into one now, this new use class order that's come out. It takes all of those, and the first floor and second floor, the space above that Class E use, can then convert to residential C3 uses under Class G. You can then use Class L after that to then go from C3 to C4. The only challenge with that is you can't do that in an Article 4 area. So where there's an Article 4 in place that in effect removes that Class L PD right that allows you to go from C3 to C4, you can't do that in Article 4 area in effect. But you can back-to-back Class L with Class G, which is a very useful and very interesting thing, frankly. It means you can go from an office building that's 3 stories high into an office on the ground floor, 2 6-bed HMOs above it. That all kind of works. Thanks very much. Subject to Article 4. So C4 to sui generis, kind of how does that work? Well, it's the conversion of a small HMO into a large one. So a 3, 4, 5, 6-bed HMO into something more than 6 beds, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever. The criteria for that to apply is typically, not always, but typically, that you look at the particular property, you draw in effect a 50-meter radius around that property, and you count the number of HMOs relative to the number of houses, and typically 10% is the magic number. If there's more than 10% of HMOs within 50 meters of that location, relative compared with the number of houses, so you want 1 HMO to 9 houses in effect, or 9 flats, then at that point, you can then, if it's less than 10%, so if you've got 1 and there's 20 houses, then you can have a second one, you still stay below that 10% threshold in effect. So that's where typically you can get C4 to sui generis. Not always, but that's typically the case. For us, I would always want to go to places where there's already HMOs there. So I kind of have comfort as a marketplace, I have comfort that the HMOs are letting in that location, rather than just putting that anywhere. Never quite sure what the marketplace is going to look like, and therefore want to make sure there's other HMOs in that area, so I'm comfortable that if I use that as my exit, that I'm not going to get kind of caught out with a marketplace not wanting it. And similar to the Article 4 that restricts from C3 to C4, that's typically the same kind of calculation that you'd see from C4 to sui generis in effect. So those are really the sort of policies that sit behind it. It's looking at the 10% calculation for HMOs to residential properties within 50 meters, typically. Not always, some counts have 100 meters, but it's typically that sort of number. There's sort of the odd funny thing around Article 4s and the calculation around that, but typically it's that sort of volume of HMOs that are relevant. So quick recap: Class G and Class L in non-Article 4 areas, C4 to sui generis and C3 to C4 in Article 4 areas. Those are typically that 50-meter radius with the 10% calculation. Other options then are low-value commercial buildings with that sort of higher value residential in the residential areas in effect. But just thinking about HMOs as a possible alternative exit at that point. Taking C3 properties and converting those to HMO is very interesting, subject to that policy and the Article 4 that might apply to it. And of course, then HMOs with potential to put more rooms into them on top of that. So where do I take a 3-bed HMO or 4-bed HMO and move that into a 6, 7, 8, or 9-bed one, where I'm going to get, in effect, get a per room rental level, which is then going to go through the roof because I'm going to create more more letting rooms. So those are the three strategies, and those are the policies that sit behind all of that. What I'd like to do now is the deal in 90 seconds, the bit that gets me hot under the collar every week when I have to go and find these things. So I'm going to do 3 lots of this. I'm going to do, let's take each of those component strategies in effect, and let's go find some opportunities. And I feel my heart going already because I have this 90-second kind of tick-tock going in the back of my mind. But what I want to do is I want to start off and just go off. I'm going to take more than 90 seconds, actually. Well, the 5 will probably take less than 90 seconds, but I want to, in effect, explain the story behind what I'm doing. I want to then just take our time to look at those opportunities and just confirm that they work. Because, of course, what we're talking about is I'm going to find 100 of these things. So I've got to send 100 letters, and I've got to go and see how that'll work, because this is how I unlock the whole thing at the start. I then want to move into kind of what I call Nimbus story time. I want to paint a picture of those buildings, those sites, through the data sets that sit behind this thing called Nimbus Maps. And I want to also challenge you to cast your minds forward. So most people find this difficult, actually. Cast your minds forward and say, well, actually, if I do this and I find a lot of opportunities, then what? Where do I go? Where do I move those opportunities to? Do I just have to go back to an owner and say, sorry, I've run out of money? Or is there something else I can do? So let's try and bring that to life for you too. So what I would like to do is I would like you to open up the chat, if you could. Michael has seen me do this before, I think. So he's already put Maidstone Kent into the chat. So I'm going to pick Maidstone Kent out as one of the locations. But I'd like to pop into the chat a location that you would like me to search. I'm going to start with Maidstone in Kent because Michael was first on the first to pull the trigger. So it was very impressive, very quick. Before I said, he obviously read my mind, or he's seen it before. I don't know which one it is, but let's start off with that. I'm going to do commercial conversions first, then we'll do some development plots. Sarah's put Cornwall in the chat, so we'll perhaps go off and do those over there. And then we'll do some HMOs in Brighton, because Patrick's put Brighton in the chat afterwards. So let me jump into Maidstone in Kent. And I'm going to, in effect, so Nimbus, for those of you who haven't used Nimbus before, so at the top here, we have this kind of Google-powered search. I'm going to type into there anything I would usually go and search for, in effect. What Nimbus then does is it plots a 250-meter radius around that location, and these red outlines that I see are title plans, in effect. They're just ownership from land registry, in effect. There's some pins and bits and pieces in the map. These little spots are leases that are registered with the land registry. They're 7 years or longer leases. They could be on flats, they could be on shops. There's kind of stuff we can do to go and look at that sort of separately, but that's kind of another day really for that. And then we have these unregistered properties. So this is where properties haven't sold in the last, since sort of 1980, 1990, and kind of before registration became a thing. In effect, they're all just unregistered, in effect. And there's kind of some tricks around that we can also do, but that's, again, for a different day. So I found Maidstone. I'm just going to clear this search for a moment, just so I can kind of clear the map up a little bit. So there's Maidstone, and for those who don't know where that is, fortunately, Michael told us it's in Kent, but I don't know where in Kent. I don't really kind of know where I am, frankly. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit so we can sort of see there's Maidstone there under my cursor there. I'm going to zoom in a second. I'm conscious I've got 90 seconds to find a site, but I'm going to get onto that in a second. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go into this thing called the overlays with Nimbus. And I want to just get a picture of what Maidstone looks like. So what this is doing here is it's plotting the little white boundaries on the map. What those are neighbourhood boundaries. And it then groups the sales prices of houses within that area on a rate per square foot and gives me an average. So what I can very quickly see across Maidstone is that this sort of northern part here, the average price, 270, 280 a foot. And actually, as we go to the south part of Maidstone, those prices go up by 10%. If I come outside of Maidstone, they're 380 a foot. So actually, you pay a premium of what's that, 50%? Not to live in Maidstone rather than to live in Maidstone, which is, I don't know, that's perhaps a controversial thing to say on a webinar with so many people watching. But that's what the information is telling us. So Maidstone itself, central Maidstone, is not really the most attractive part of Maidstone and of Kent. But it's, I suppose, for me, those values are reasonable. It's kind of high enough for us to find some opportunities. So that's kind of helped me get the understanding of Maidstone itself. We then have some HMOs. So while we're in HMOs, we're going to sort of talk about HMOs when we come to Brighton in a moment, where Patrick put Brighton into the chat. So we've got some, we could look at HMOs as a marketplace. There's not many HMOs there, but there are some. So there is clearly a marketplace for Maidstone HMOs, if you like, but it's not quite as strong as other places. So we could think about that. And yields in effect. So so I can 5% out of a 1-bed flat. I can get sort of 5.6, 5.7% out of flats, and sort of 4.3, sort of between 4 and 4.5% out of houses rather in that area. So there's sort of a sensible yield for that too. So I'm starting to build a picture around the different exits I might have in Maidstone. But of course, what we said was that I now want to look for Class MA. I'm going to go for the new one, basically. So Class MA, can I find some Class MA PD rights in 90 seconds? I'm going to take a drink of water before I get too hot under the collar. So, with me feeling relaxed and not at all tense, in essence, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that site in 90 seconds. So in essence, what this shows me here is it shows me the Class E properties that, well, there we go, that was kind of easy, wasn't it? So when I do these deals in 90 seconds, it's literally as simple as I click on the strategy, plot it into the map, and what the map then shows me is it shows me a color coding. So I feel like I found something. That's why I'm kind of now in my head, the timer's been switched off in effect. So it's showing me here, we've got Bower Lane tyres. It's a 2,500 Class E vehicle workshop in effect. What it's saying is that the sales prices in this part of Maidstone are about $320 a foot for kind of goods, second-hand, kind of new build-ish residential properties in effect. If we were to convert that building under Class MA, then it's saying there should be about £100 a foot conversion cost. Yeah, reasonably sympathetic conversion. The building's 2,500 square feet. It's then saying that the rental level for that building is about £10 a foot. And if we paid 7% net initial yield for that, that would equate to £140 a foot in effect. So the building's worth $820 once it's built. It's going to cost $250 to build it, or convert it rather, and that existing use value is probably about 360 grand, something like that. Those numbers then give us a 33% return on cost, and typically we're off about 25%. So I've kind of got 8% extra that's left over for this property in effect. So what it means, if we sort of try and tie this back to what we said at the start of this webinar, is that if I'm after 25% return on cost and I can make 33 out of this building, then that extra 8% I can share with the owner. So I can share 4% return on cost and give 4% of that to the owner of the property. So if we just kind of use some broad numbers here, so in effect, it's kind of about a quarter. That's about 50 grand, I guess, that I've got left over. I can afford to pay, I suppose, anything up to about 50 grand over that price. So I could probably pay somewhere near 400 grand if I needed to go and buy that building just on a simple Class MA conversion, because I know that I still want 25% return on cost. So I go off, get my planning consent, my money's in the profit on the build in effect, so I can buy a £350,000 building with a planning consent for 400 grand, which is 50 grand more than his owner's going to get elsewhere, and therefore happy days, off we go in effect. So I'll look at a bit more detail this particular property, so we can kind of get ourselves comfortable that it works. So it's sat behind there, just in there. Well, that kind of looks to me to be something quite interesting. So it's in effect this thing here, and actually it's probably rather more than Class MA. So what you're probably doing with something like that is getting your planning ticket to convert it, and then going back into, in effect, you've then removed that use. So it's no longer an MOT bay. Actually, it's an MOT bay with a residential consent to convert it under Class MA PD rights. And then you go back into something much more comprehensive with the established use now of a converted MOT bay in effect as the into residential in effect. So you've got a residential use on the site with the Class MA put in place. So I feel pretty happy that that's an opportunity that I found, and that's very much worth a letter. So the question is, well, how do I let a campaign? Well, it's very simple. I click on this little button here. That gives me the title itself. This shows me all the stuff that's on it in effect. So you've got the light industrial workshop in effect. You've got details around it's half an acre of site. You've got kind of building footprints here, which are kind of all sorts of different bits and pieces. Building heights. You've got the commercial uses on the site. In effect, the vehicle workshop and the and the car parking spaces that are also there. We've got a planning history, we've got EPCs, we've got price paid and this sort of stuff. I'm going to find particulars for properties that are sold and this sort of stuff. But kind of crucially, I can see the building's not listed, not in a flood zone, not in Greenbelt, not in AONB. So we've kind of got all that stuff sort of ticked off as part of that very quick snapshot of the building, in effect. What I'll then do is add that to a thing called workflow, pop that into here. Well, I can see this property's in private ownership just here. So if I save that to my workflow is this sort of Kanban board, in effect. This is kind of the trick to what I said about unlocking this stuff off market. How do I find 100 sites that then I can go and mail campaign to then unlock these sites with the owner, bringing them on the journey and buying these things under option or subject to planning? Well, this is the answer, quite frankly. This is all I do is I go through that little process of looking at those sites, making sure I'm kind of comfortable, they look sensible, I'm kind of happy I can get to the right numbers. The calculations have been done for me by, in effect, the Elite Plus system here. Those then, in effect, get stored in this sort of Kanban board, in effect. And from here, I can then use a little download button here, which in effect pulls out all these sites into Excel for me. And I can then mail shop from that Excel file, whether I use something like Doc Mail or UK Mail or Stamp or something like that, where I can load a template letter into it and then use that little download that I have from Nimbus there to then power that sort of that letter campaign, in effect. So kind of very quick way of doing that. If it's in private ownership, then all you do is you buy a title register through us, and Nimbus will extract all that information off the title register, put the owner's details into this export, in effect. So that mail campaigning is really, really very, very quick, very simple, because of course the magic number is 100 letters. 100 letters you can either do through a mail merge and print it off onto your local printer, or you can use one of those mail house providers. Very quick and simple to set up, very easy to do, and off you go, in effect. So that's your process. What's kind of nice about that is when they then come back and say, oh, I saw that you wrote to me regarding the Maidstone Exhaust Centre, I can then talk to them very comfortably about the scheme. Oh yeah, I think Class NA might apply to that. Well, I know that because it's shown me here on the right-hand side. I think very interesting. I see you've got just over half an acre of land. I can see that you've got a 2,500 square foot vehicle repair shop on that site. I think the rent's about 10 quid a foot, something like that. But crucially, it's not listed, it doesn't flood, not in a Greenbelt or AONB. And that can be got across in the first phone call when that person picks the phone up. So immediately I'm driving confidence to that owner that I understand their building, and all I've done is read off the information panel off Nimbus, frankly. So that's how I can build that credibility very, very quickly. So I feel like we've looked at that quite simply. I feel like I can go and find a few more bits and pieces if we sort of still like Maidstone and we still like these opportunities. I guess some of this stuff might be interesting. So there's a little doctor's surgery, 1,100 square feet, same principles apply. See what else we've got. What's this up here? That might be interesting. Day nursery again. All this stuff now is part of this new Class E that's in place. How do I get it empty? Well, I use Class G as part of that to do the upper parts first, and then go back in for my Class NA if I need to. These sort of are then slightly less interesting because their 28% return on costs is 39%. So I can sort of see where those numbers stack up. Another vehicle wear shop, another vehicle repair workshop here. So this is 4,000 feet, Southern Tyre Company that's this one. So kind of very quickly, I can see that these buildings all seem to stack up nicely, seem to be interesting. And I can just go and write these letters to these owners very quickly. So in essence, that's how I go and find those 100 sites. I then use the little workflow section. What's 85% return on cost down there? Let's look at that one. What's that? Another vehicle. There's a fair few vehicle repair shops around here. This one's got a lot more value in it. So this car 176 grand, well, it's only 800 square feet, and it's got a 700 grand exit value again. Looks like quite a big lump as well, actually. Looks like it's kind of quite a lot on quite a big site that sort of sits on as well. There's quite a lot around here, isn't there? It's kind of it's almost makes me sort of want to start talking about Middle England again, which is something that I particularly like. Again, shop here, 2,500 feet shop. This has got a much higher value as residential than as commercial, of course. Some more here, again, another shop on the corner there. Kind of interesting to see whether those are the upper parts, just the ground floor that's bringing back. Lloyd's Pharmacy, whether I want to convert a Lloyd's Pharmacy, that's probably unlikely. But actually, what it is saying is that the numbers would stack up to go and do that. So tempting, not sure. So that's how we can use the elite pluses to go and get those 100 sites. Let's kind of move on now into the next part. So I've got Cornwall. So Sarah's put Cornwall in the chat. So I'm going to do something pretty bullish. So I'm going to type Cornwall into the chat, into the search. So this is obviously Cornwall, that sort of southwest corner of the country. In one of the challenges I think across Cornwall we're going to find is actually, in fact, it's not too bad. There's sort of parts of Cornwall that are quite weak in terms of sales values, and that's going to be a challenge for us. So do I dare go to St Ives and try and find some land in St Ives? I mean, that sounds pretty punchy. Let's give it a go. Let's just see if the Elite Plus system can find me anything in St Ives that's going to give me some development plots. This is probably going to try to explain the fact that there is more land available than we think, actually. And so I've used this thing on Elite Plus, these development plots. What this is really doing is sort of showing me where do we find these houses. In effect, they're individual houses that have got much bigger gardens than the neighbouring properties. I'm conscious that levels could be a problem in this part of in St Ives here. So I'm sort of slightly worried that this might be challenging, but we'll have a look and see what they look like. So there's a big old lump here that's 1.8 acres, so 1.12 acres, which is kind of what that's bringing back there. I'm just kind of want to check it's not listed, which is not. It's not in the flood zone, not in Greenbelt. So in effect, it's a big house with a big garden in effect. And what's often kind of interesting with these is when you sort of switch across into this thing called the Ordnance Survey Master Map, because typically what this strategy does is it shows you where in this sort of part of town, if you like, are those buildings that lay out in a way that's a bit eclectic. So in effect, what we've got here is, I suppose, we're sort of right on the edge of St Ives, and I've sort of switched across onto the Ordnance Survey Master Map. And the reason I've done that is that actually the property that's being highlighted is this one here. And actually for me, there sort of appears to be sort of a very natural kind of build line. And we're inside the sort of settlement boundary, the kind of the envelope of the settlement, if you like. And so for me, there's opportunity to build around here. There perhaps even opportunity to perhaps do something in the back of this particular property. There's clearly space to do something there. Maybe I could kind of come in and sort of split a plot off to the side here. There's probably something I can do around here as well. So could I sort of bring the entrance into there and perhaps do something with the two of these together? So could I get the two owners of these two properties to talk to me in effect and try to get something unlocked that way? Up here, I've got this sort of very small house. And actually what I probably could get is sort of 3 or 4 in here, probably as perhaps one at the back and one at the side and perhaps one at the front, something like that. I kind of wonder if I could do something more with crisping down here as well, where you can kind of get sort of look at the way that's laid out and then how this one's laid out. And could I sort of squeeze more in? Perhaps could I just get a piece of land off Red Willows at the back there and sort of split that into 3 in effect? So very quick ways, hopefully, just for you to see how you can find those land. And I guess kind of the more you do of this, the more it becomes pretty addictive, actually, in terms of, you know, where is that sort of building line and where do those sort of patterns change, and where they do change is where the opportunity is created. I guess that even drives down something very simple, where you sort of look at the size of the site that building sits on relative to this particular house here, where it's kind of half the size in effect. So is there a simple refurb, knock down and rebuild? There's clearly a plot there that's sitting empty in effect. Is there something perhaps doing the side garden there? Maybe, I don't know, perhaps a little bit too tight, that the sort of building next door, so maybe not in that case, but in effect, sort of very quick ways that you can sort of see how you can sort of fill in that frontage. Again, sort of here, there's an opportunity there. Clearly, this is, again, quite an interesting opportunity that's brought back. Again, side garden there, side garden here. So kind of very quick ways that you could very easily sort of drive value into those sites in effect. So that's the kind of the simple way to find those. There are various other strategies that you can apply to go and see residential land and airspace. My guess is I'm going to struggle to find Class ZA in St Ives. Let's give it a go. Let's see if we can find some Class ZA, because it's about airspace as much as anything else. So let's have a little play with that. So let's get rid of the development plots and let's go onto the Class ZA PD rights and see if we can find anything. We might just get lucky, but we might not as well. Doesn't look like it's bringing anything back. It's probably AOMB, it's probably the reason why it's not bringing anything back, but there's something there, whatever that is. Doesn't look particularly big or attractive, does it? But so that's bringing back a little store that's £6 a foot. Well, that's probably as more interesting as residential actually, rather than Class ZA, but it is at least sort of a potential for Class ZA, frankly. Let's have a little zoom out and see if there's sort of better parts of Cornwall that might be more interesting. Well, there's sort of more stuff down here. Let's just see what we've got down in Penzance. Not an awful lot, but there's just one or two bits that perhaps are interesting. So you've got a sort of car park there. I'm not sure that's particularly interesting. There's an office building there that perhaps is interesting. It's kind of got a low value there and quite a big profit that might sit alongside it in effect. So this then is perhaps kind of interesting with your sort of offices that you could go and unlock. That's owned by a company called Walker Moyle Limited. They've owned that since 2016. Walker Moyle are an accounting and bookkeeping company. They're accounts firm, frankly. They're based out of Penzance. It's probably their sort of office that they work from. Maybe they'd look at perhaps doing a sale and lease back or something. There's the set of accounts, the last set of accounts for them. See how they're getting on, see how lockdowns affected them. So they've got balance sheet's actually gone up, so they sort of seem to be doing okay sort of through the last couple of years, 2019, 2020. They've sort of balance sheet's gone up and stuff, so they look like they're okay. There's the sort of people behind the business, all accountants. Only one person actually active, so the Ronald Crooks has actually retired and resigned in 2017, but the Paula Thomas is the person that's kind of leading the show there at the moment. So kind of perhaps interesting around all of that. Planning history for it, some price paid information, bought it in 2016. There's the office itself, so it's cross ground, first floor. Some very low values though, so this is typically pretty low value in terms of what office space looks like. Sort of £6-7 is pretty tired office space, quite frankly. So hopefully that's makes sense. I feel we should move on now. I feel like we should go off to Brighton and start doing something different. So let's do exactly that. Let's start looking HMOs across Brighton. So this, of course, is Brighton. Let's clear that search for a moment so we can just sort of get our bearings. Brighton is going to be a pocket of value in that sort of south coast. So if we just sort of look at that, some of the values sort of in Brighton are pretty strong. So £500 a foot average sales price at the front there, I suspect would be sort of north of £600 a foot on a sort of a new build scheme in central Brighton. My guess is we've probably got quite a few HMOs. Wow, yeah, so there you go. So there's all the registered HMOs across Brighton. We've got an awful lot of those. Now, my guess is with so many HMOs in a place like this, then we're going to have Article 4 in place. So let's have a little look and see if we can unlock some residential opportunities to convert to HMO. What you tend to find in a place like Brighton, where you've got presumably an Article 4 in place, we'll go and check that in a moment, then what you'll typically find is that developers for HMOs will look at it and go, that's a bit difficult to try and find HMOs in that location. So go and buy an existing one. Article 4 is in place. There's loads of HMOs. I'm just not going to bother looking, frankly. And that, of course, is where it's so interesting as an opportunity, because the fact there's so many HMOs there means there's a great marketplace for HMOs. There's a lot of people who want to go and live in HMOs in Brighton, which means if I can build some HMOs in Brighton, then I'll fill them every day of the week, very, very happily. Thanks very much. But the question is, where do I find them? So let's have a little play with this. Let's jump into the strategies here. And I'm going to do the hard one. I'm going to do C3 to HMO in effect. So this is saying, where do I see a C3 house that presumably here is going to be protected by an Article 4, so the council are trying to stop me doing this. But actually what it's going to do is it's going to show me where there's less than 10% of HMOs relative to the number of houses that are there, or C3 houses in effect. But where's an HMO marketplace in effect? So what we can then see is that there's whole swathes of properties here that don't work, but actually just a few and a handful that do work. So we can do the same thing. I can go and send letters to these owners, and I can go and unlock these opportunities from them. And I suppose crucially, what's kind of interesting with them is that same OS master map that I showed you a moment ago to say, where can I find little pockets of land in St Ives? I mean, God, who thought there was actually some land in St Ives? It's the place that it's the most packed in place you could think of. So you all kind of know what St Ives is like, I suspect. Interesting with this is that I suppose when you look at some of these properties here, you can see how big you can get sort of buildings onto them. So you sort of put this big extension on the back and this sort of stuff. But actually, these couple of properties here are individual houses. What they've got is in Article 4 areas, so it is exactly that. But actually 92, 91 and 93 all have a percentage of HMOs to residential properties in that area at 6 or 7%. So actually one more would be absolutely fine. So that is then how I can go and get a particular from because actually the calculation works for that. And what's kind of interesting with these is, of course, that actually these haven't been extended yet. So I could probably put a big extension on the back like this, and perhaps even bring the back wall out slightly, to then give me more rooms on the ground floor, perhaps even a little bit more upstairs as well, depending on kind of whether I get 2 stories on those. Let's have a look and see if we can just bring that to life for a moment. Let's quickly switch this around. So these are your, let's get rid of that for a second. So we're looking at these, so yes, so there's a 2-story extension at the back, look. So we could put a whole 2-story sort of extension on the back of those particular buildings and apply those to some of these further down here in effect. So having already uncovered the fact that we know we can go and get the change of use in effect through the Article 4 calculation in effect. So hopefully all of that makes sense, and hopefully that's kind of made it clear how I can go and find 100 opportunities, how I can send 100 letters out, how off the back of those I can then get the sort of the 5 hot leads that come off the back of those 100 letters, and how I can then go and close 1 in 5 of those, and I've then got the deals that I particularly want. So let's just shoot back into my slides. So what I wanted to do today, in fact, before I move on back to my slides, the other thing that I said as part of this was that 2 things. I said I need a good design team. So I need a good design team that's going to understand, in the case of this, HMOs in Brighton in effect. So where do I find one of those? And the second thing I'm interested in is, where will I find, if I get too many opportunities, if I send 200 letters out and I've got 2 sites and I can only afford to buy 1, what do I do with that second site? Well, let me paint a little picture around all of that. So here I can see on the information panel that Brighton and Hove is the council that covers this location. And in the Nimbus Elite system, we have this thing called the planning export. So I'm going to type in Brighton and Hove, and I'm then going to do an HMO opportunities search in effect. It's going to go off and find, in effect, what this is doing is going off and looking for these words across Brighton and Hove Council. I'm going to click export. There's kind of some stuff we can do with this. We can do residential opportunities, we can do commercial stuff, we can do PD rights, show me all the Class G conversions, this sort of stuff. So we can do some really cool stuff with that planning export. But what we can also do as part of this is we can go off and find all the planning applications that mention an HMO. So what we can see, so here we go, there's a change of use from sui generis to sui generis in effect. It's kind of a planning application. So I just kind of show you what this is showing me. So this is done a search for all the planning applications that mention the word HMO in Brighton and Hove, so across their entire council. So I've got the link here to where that planning application was found in effect, the reference number for it, then the fact that the planning application went in. So we've got a removal of condition, perhaps less interesting, but certificate of lawfulness to create a 6th bedroom in a C4 HMO, small house into a C4, C3 to C4, C3 to C4. So all of this stuff, C4 to sui generis. So all of these things are kind of relevant to the things we're talking about across Brighton and Hove. The same is true for commercial conversions. The same is true for the residential land. In the middle here, I have the date it was submitted. We have the address of the property itself, the title number that the property sits on. Here's the link to Nimbus to go and see that. And of course, we have the owner's name an address. So where it's in company ownership, Nimbus provides you with that. Where it's in private ownership, you can go off and buy a title register, and that will show you who owns that property. We have the date the property was last sold and the price that was paid for that property. So that's all interesting. Let's just kind of continue. What I do, I'm going to put the filters on at the top here. As we then scroll across, what we also then have is the applicant's name, so who submitted that planning application. And on the right, we have the agent's name, so who submitted the planning application on behalf of the applicant. Who was the planner or the architect that submitted this planning application on behalf of these people, in effect. So that's the file that I've got. So why is that helpful? Well, the reason that's helpful is that if I go back to the date this property was last sold, on the left, I have planning applications relevant to HMOs. That's useful. In the middle here, I can then filter that. So it will show me properties that sold in the last 3 years. So in effect, it's been bought and then an HMO planning application has gone in on it. So what I will find as part of that is that here's a list of people, companies or people that have bought properties in Brighton and Hove and then submitted HMO planning applications in on them. Which means that if I then find 200 opportunities and I can only afford to buy one of the 2 sites that those 200 opportunities would offer me, in effect, then of course all of these people in this list here, and there are 73 of them, all of those people have recently bought properties and submitted a planning application around HMOs on. So they will understand what it is I've got in mind when I go forward with this particular site and I've got whatever property it is that I've found that has come off that Elite Plus strategy or something like that. These people will understand the things that I'm doing with that particular property. What's also useful is that I have the price they paid for that. So I can then start to say, well, actually, the price that I'm paying sits in line with what they were paying for their site, or doesn't sit in line with it, and therefore I'm overpaying or I'm underpaying, but I can get a feel for where they were and where I am now to make sure that I'm paying the right kind of price. So I have, in effect, a land comp on that point there. And if I run the same export for the residential opportunities, I will very much get that land comp. What's a plot of land worth in Brighton and Hove? Well, I run that same planning export using the residential opportunities rather than the HMO opportunities, and it will tell me this person paid 350 grand for a pair of semis, in effect, a plot for a pair of semis. Therefore, sales price for a plot of land for a single semi is 175 grand. In effect, it's kind of what that would tell me. And of course, what's interesting then as well is that we've got firstly a list of local developers, but secondly then a list of all of the companies that those local developers are trusting with their sites. So here's a list of those planning consultants that the local developers trust and use for their planning application. So we can see here Lewis and Company Planning clearly doing a lot of work in that area. What else have we got? AHP Architects. And actually what you can do with this is you can just kind of cheat a little bit and do this. And you'll see, so there's a lot there. Derby Architectural Limited doing quite a lot. Planning Practice Limited, Whaleback. Again, so lists of those locally active people that are supporting the local planners and the local developers to move their sites forward, in effect. So hopefully that's kind of helped to understand how you can then find local developers that you can pitch this stuff onto. I suppose the final thing I wanted to quickly show was that whilst we're in Brighton and Hove, one of the big challenges when it comes to HMOs is what are these things worth, in effect? So if I just say I'm going to go and try and acquire this particular property here, what we have in the Elite system is a little set of comparables here. So I can say, just show me residential comparables in the map, in effect. When I click apply, the system then shows me all those properties that have sold. And I can then export those into Excel. And off the back of that export, it will tell me when they sold, what they sold for, how big they were, and indeed, crucially, whether they were HMOs. So in the case of this, actually an HMO here that sold for 1.3 million. It was an HMO there, and I can then go off and have a look at that property on Rightmove. So 91 Ditchling Road, which is then where I can go and see the details of that. Not a huge number of HMOs that have sold in the last couple of years in that location. So I could then extend that search and look a bit further around and see which properties have sold, in effect. So hopefully that has been helpful. Let's just quickly jump back into slides. I'm going to do a quick live Q&A in a second. So let's just quickly jump back into here. So this is typically the process you'll go through with Nimbus. Typically, you'll take a 14-day free trial with us. Then you'll go into a one-to-one demonstration. If then you like what you see, then you can sign up to the Elite platform. And indeed, then if you like that, you want some help finding sites in line with the strategies I've been talking about today, then our Elite Plus system will very much help you with that. The Elite Plus actually ties very neatly with what I've been talking about today. So there are 3 packages that the Elite Plus system comes with. The first one is the commercial conversions package, which targets the things we've talked about today. The second one is the residential land and airspace opportunities, which again targets stuff we've done today. And of course, the third one are the HMO opportunities. The commercial conversions targets, as we say, the Class MA opportunities, the Class G, the Class ZA, and it is a separate strategy around low-value residential properties commercial properties in residential areas. There's a residential land and airspace package, so that looks at development plots, low-value commercial properties in residential areas, Class ZA, and then the Class AA, A and AB, and of course the AC and AD properties as well. And of course, then there's the HMO package, which looks at the C3 to C4, which is what I used a moment ago. There's one with HMOs with value properties and G opportunities too. So those are of overlays that target specific types of buildings in line with what we've talked about today. That allow you then to go and find those 100 sites, send your letters out, and then unlock those deals off market and sort of benefit from the benefits I've talked about today, in effect. Good news is that there's a sale on at the moment, so the sale runs until Friday. The Elite package on its own is £95 a month, down from £120 a month, save you 300 quid. The Elite Plus system, then you can add a single package, so a single one of those strategies, whether that's commercial conversions, whether that's residential land and airspace or HMOs. That then is £195 a month to include one of those 3 packages. Or you can go onto our Elite Max system, which has all 3 packages together, and that's £250 a month, down to £466 a month in effect. If anybody would like to take advantage of that, there's a bit.ly link at the bottom there, which I will pop into the chat. That would, in effect, get you a call with our team at Nimbus, who will be able to run you through which might be right for you, and obviously help you sign up to any of that if you're interested. I'll pop that link into the chat, albeit I've misspelt that, so I'm just going to do that again. Give me 2 seconds. Ignore that one that I popped in there, because I need to put a full stop in rather than a / for so it's bit.ly/hot strategies. It should get you a link through to our team at Nimbus. So if anybody else is interested in that, let me just launch a quick poll as well. I'm going to take a 2-second break, and we're going to come back for a live Q&A after that. So the first question I've launched in the poll is, if you'd like to know more about Nimbus Maps, then that first question is for you. If you'd like to discuss the suitable options for you with one of our team, then that second question is for you. I'm going to take a very brief break for a moment, have a little drink of water. I'll back with you in literally under 2 minutes. Fabulous. So let me just end that poll there. And then just move into the live Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask a question, what I'd like to do is to just open up your Zoom control panel. And if I can ask you to raise your hand, we'll just have 3 or 4 minutes to answer any questions. So Darren's just raised his hand. Let me stop my share. Let's see if we can get you up to talk. Hi, Darren. I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself. Hi, Darren.
Hi there.
How are you doing?
Great, thanks. You?
Yes, very well. Thank you. Very well.
Great. Just a question I had was quite interesting when you were showing us the estimated costs on the first example, and it had the estimate for the build costs.
Yeah.
And I was just interested to see, or not necessarily see the nuts and bolts behind it, but to understand how the system goes about working that out and whether it's regularly updated in line with, say, market conditions as they are today, and how they might have been previously, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So the answer is so at the moment it sort of runs a sort of a local calculation to say what do we think build costs are in that area, and then it applies a 2/3 of new builds sort of cost to that in effect. So it's looking at kind of quite sympathetic conversions in effect, where in essence what it's aiming at is saying it's going to be a sympathetic conversion. It's going to be reusing the existing structure, so it's going to be in effect taking it back to the bare brickwork, replumbing, rewiring, that kind of stuff, but not a sort of a full-on take the whole thing out, re-roof, re-windows, new windows and this sort of stuff. So it's sort of back of a fag packet. And you're not supposed to use that term anymore. It's supposed to be back of an envelope calculation, I hear. But in effect, it's that. So it's sort of saying what's that sort of sensible number that aligns with the GDV that means you're kind of calculating like for like, and it's then creating that kind of hurdle rate of what it needs to get above that in order for the thing to be let through in effect. So it's by no means a red book valuation, but it is a very sensible kind of conservative look at saying, well, when we get to the point of doing our QS cost plan, and we get to the point of doing full-blown set of comps and working out exactly what this thing's worth to buy and to sell and all that stuff, that we've got a really good chance of all of that lining up, and that we then can do the things we want to do at the start, which is to get an owner, pay a bit more than it's worth, provided they come on the journey and you share the risk with them in effect. So it's designed to kind of focus your sights, if you like, rather than give you the final appraisal.
Yeah.
But it then puts you in a place where when you do that work, it should jolly well come out with the right answer in effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, very much so. Just quickly then on that, so as you were saying, it's sympathetic to whatever it is that you're looking at. So if you were in the residential plot strategy, it would then be looking at out the ground development. So obviously that would be higher based on new build costs, pretty much.
Yeah, sure. So the where the strategies are looking at, so like Class A, knocking buildings down and rebuilding them, it's putting full new build costs in on top of that. Where it's looking at building on top of existing buildings, it's putting even more on top, actually. So it's kind of it's more than new build, because you've got kind of bracing to worry about, or underpinning and this sort of stuff. So yeah, again, it's a sensible number based on what that predicted scheme is going to look like. Every scheme's different, whether it's got asbestos in it, whether it's got, whatever, all of that stuff, there's levels of complexity. We don't know every single building, but we know that broadly speaking, it should be in that kind of ballpark, and therefore that's what's being allowed in effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, great explanation. So yeah, it's pretty much what I've been looking for. Something not to give me the exact number, but just to give me a starting point
Sure.
to then branch out from that. So that's great. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Darren. Let's see if we can get Anastasia next. Hi, Anastasia.
Hi, how are you?
How you doing? I'm struggling to hear you, Anastasia, actually. Just struggling to hear you. It's very muffled, actually. There's something wrong with your microphone. Let's just see if I can get Peter up first, and perhaps if you have a look at your microphone, Anastasia, then we'll come back to that. That's okay. Hi, Peter.
Hiya. I just want to see if a person wants to use class L after use class G to register the property as C3. How does a person go about it, and how long does a person have to keep it C3 before you can go for use class L?
That's a good question. I think that you have to implement the planning consent in effect. So I think check with your planner, but I believe that in effect you get your kind of your PD rights for class G, you implement, and then having implemented them, then you then go and implement your class L in effect. And I believe, I don't know how long that is actually. There's a question for the planners actually, but I know you can back to back the two together in effect. Question for your planner just to run through for you.
Thanks.
Does that make sense? Fabulous. We seem to have lost Anastasia. I think she's struggling with her microphone. So let's we'll leave that there. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Nadeem asked a question, someone starting out with a small amount of funding, how do you recommend to scale using Nimbus for off-market deals? So the answer to that, Nadeem, is that in effect, you need to be looking for external finance. So in essence, typically the way you're going to find that external finance is that you're going to find either friends and family, which is kind of one place to look. Second place to look is people that have bought similar properties in effect. So local developers will kind of understand what it is you're doing. So I showed you that on the planning export. And if that's going to find you local developers, you can go and reach out to those people. On that export, it's going to show you this is the address of the property they bought. So you can ring that developer up and you can say, oh, if you get through to the receptionist, you can say, well, I wanted to speak to somebody about and quote the address of the property they bought. When you get through to that person, you say, well, I saw you bought this, just interested to see if it was a really interesting scheme. Just interested to know if you wanted anything else, if you've got any other kind of plans to buy anything else, and if so, I might have something that might be interesting for you. So in effect, you're bringing forward a list of opportunities, you're kind of working a list of sites in effect, and at the same time working a list of investors juggling those two things at the same time. It's a very interesting webinar guy called Mark Stokes at the at Equa Academy who sort of talks through that approach. So check that out. It's on our website. Look into the learning section of the Nimbus website. You'll see that video. Equally to one earlier this year with Matt Siddell at Candor. Again, he was very interesting with all of that as well. So and of course Ranjan Bhattacharya has obviously got some good insights around that as well. So check out the previous webinars on our website, and that'll kind of perhaps help you with all of that. So I think there's so Sikandar's asked about Class A, AA, and AB, where the building height is less than 24 meters after the proposed development or prior. Yes, you're quite right. There is a building height restriction on that. So I think the completed building is less than 24 meters. I thought it was on the slides, but if it wasn't, then my apologies. But I think you are right on that. Fabulous. Well, I think that's all of the questions. So let me just jump back into my slides, because the final thing that I need to be doing is just simply getting control of what I'm doing would be a helpful starting point, actually. It's really just to say thank you to you all for watching today. Hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully you've found benefit in the three different strategies that you can take now, and hopefully it's now clear about how you can unlock those. I've had fun. Hopefully you have too. Thanks for listening. I've been Paul Davis. We've been Nimbus Maps. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best. Bye for now.